Welcome to Spiritual Studies session number 20. This is on all manner of mythical creature, explaining the ancient mythology of the past. There are many ways to understand this. I'm going to start with going through a tremendous amount of this talk is going to cover all these different mythological creatures, giving context. Some of them I will outright explain exactly how we can understand them. Others are going to be more ambiguous. At the end, we will kind of sum up all of these different rationales. So through this talk, you will gain an understanding of what these mythical creatures are really about, and how we've misunderstood them as fantastical because we don't have the original cultural contexts that they originated from. So first, I'm going to talk about the vampire, the most ubiquitous of, or one of the most ubiquitous of them all. If you're missing some of the like specific ones that you're looking for, like for instance the werewolf or chimeras, you need to go back onto this channel or back into the spiritual studies course and get to the last session on shape-shifting shamanism and chimeras. So again, let's start with vampires. So as a strict definition, right, we have a night-walking, blood-gorged, undead corpse, right? And this term is early on tied to witches as well, which is a whole nother segment. You have various concepts of it, mostly coming from across Eastern Europe and moving its way west into the Germanic. There actually isn't a good originating etymological word. Oftentimes you can trace words very far back. This is a kind of standalone term, vampire. So later on we see as the symbology of vampire changes through time, the most ubiquitous part of it is a person who preys on other people. So as some traits, they hunt at night. Sunlight either kills them or weakens them. Some have the, more fantastical ability in the olden times to not just warp into a bat, but also into a wolf. Some have super strength. There is this older characteristic of being hypnotic or having a sensual effect, which would be brought back in like Twilight and all that, right? And this interesting note that they don't cast shadows and that they can't see their image in the mirror, right? This is all cliche. So to start kind of unpacking this a little bit, the superstitions around vampirism really came up in the Middle Ages, as with most of these fantastical or mythic creatures that we're going to be talking about. So especially they became popular when the plague was coming through. And this plague would often leave these bleeding lesions of the mouth on its victims. So this would have been a trait of vampirism as a concept. So the plague is one contribution to its origination. It wasn't uncommon for anyone with a kind of abnormality or unfamiliar physical or emotional illness to be labeled as a vampire. So it's really something that would be given to anybody who's out of the fold of standard society. And you have this condition, porphyria, which is a blood disorder that again causes these severe blisters on the skin once somebody is exposed to sunlight. And strangely enough, this condition can be relieved by ingesting small quantities of blood as a remedy to this condition. So this particular condition, this physical condition, porphyria, or things like goiter or rabies, all of these conditions could be considered when it comes to the origination of where this vampirism came from. When people quote like Vlad the Impaler, the original vampire, that is mostly just I can't remember the original author that poised that, but that's mostly just storytelling. Yeah, this guy was notable and he was recorded as drinking the blood of his enemies, but to solely make Vlad the Impaler the origination of vampirism is a severe oversimplification of the story. So why it's an oversimplification is that the kind of cliche or the motif of consuming blood or the flesh of other people goes back to Mesopotamia. It goes back to Egypt. You have these ancient spirits, these ancient demons that were labeled or known for eating the flesh of humans, drinking the blood of humans, that they did this for different, sinister reasons. Again, this goes all the way back to the beginning of civilization. So the codifying idea that these are specific types of people, that is a newer one, because before it was all about specific gods like Sekhmet of the Egyptians, or the ghouls of Arabia. They were more abstract entities, but to make them more humanesque was the development of the Middle Ages. And mind you too, so this all sounds fantastical. They sound like a different type of people entirely, but let's just break this down allegorically some more. So yeah, you can trace it to these different medical conditions of the past. Also, when you're digging up dead bodies, they can bloat. There's these stories of them digging up people who have been dead that are completely preserved as if they weren't decaying in death. All these things can hint towards where vampirism originates from. However, there is this common concept of energy vampires, right? Narcissists. And if you kind of look at these symptoms of vampirism allegorically, right? So this person can't see their shadow. This person can't see themselves in the mirror. So somebody who's not developing in life, somebody who's very self-decided, somebody who's very self-involved, they aren't opening their mind. So they're maintaining their personality endlessly. They are not going to change themselves. They're going to feed off other people, instigate other people for their self-grandiosity. So, your average human maybe, or just a certain type of people will change throughout life. They'll learn things. They'll take on different personality traits. This vampirism idea is kind of this pointing out of the narcissist, where they are technically, that personality that they hold has an immortality, because it's not that they live forever, it's just that they would maintain that till the end of time, that they are so closed off from anything else that they have this vampiric tendency. To anyone who's been in like bad codependent abusive relationships, to say that that person's like a vampire, to say they're afraid of sunlight, and sunlight in this way would be an ancient symbol for truth. I mean, come on. This is all something that you could also view very allegorically. So there's that, and there's one way that we're going to be looking at some of these ancient creatures. So the other thing that we need to tie to this discussion of vampire is this term that they used to use instead of vampire, which is Lamia. Lamia is technically just a female demon. So it could be likened to the term sorceress, vampire, or witch. And Lamia would in particular be a reference to a female vampire or a man-eating monster, literally meaning swallower or lecher. Lemos is the throat. It's related to the word larynx. And it's also, strangely enough, related to the term lemur, like the monkeys. The spirits of the dead is where the word lemur comes from. And I'll explain that in a moment. So in Middle English, not just vampires are tied to Lamia, but also mermaids, and we'll get to that later as well. A frequent thing that's going to come up in this talk is that these old creatures, they blend together. You'd think that they're all distinct, but they all kind of hint towards other creatures involved in this kind of sprawling mythos. So in Greek mythology, Lamia was a child-eating monster. After her children were destroyed, because of Hera learning that she had had an affair with Zeus. I mean, this is a common trope of, Greek mythology, the Greek pantheon. So in jealousy, Hera afflicted her with sleeplessness. So she would always anguish. And then Zeus, to pity her, removed her eyes. So she became this kind of nightmarish creature. And Lamia was created by the Greeks as a kind of boogeyman, something that would frighten and could be used to discipline children. This is another theme of ancient creatures, to invent something fearful to keep children, teenagers, young adults obedient. Boogeymen. So this creature, Lamia, in the mythology, would seduce young people in order to satiate their, sexual desires, and then would feed on their flesh afterwards. It kind of sounds like a Black Widow situation, right? And the Lamia is generally depicted with snake features, like the bottom of her is a snake, and we can see how this bleeds into the Gorgons that are, Medusa in Greek mythology too. It's rooted in this term or in this trope of Lamia, which again is related to vampire. So she would be depicted as part serpent, and you see this influence spread out to many other mythologies as well, of half women, half snake beasts. You see this in Libyan myths as well. So when I mentioned lemur before and why it's related to it, you're like, why are monkeys involved in this, right? The old understanding of the lemurs was that they had like this ghost-like appearance, reflective eyes, and they have these ghastly cries into the night. So, it's weird at night, it's dark, it's scary, and then you hear these cries, right? And so that's where the name lemur was given, as if they're ghosts or something. And of course, the locals had legends that the lemurs were the souls of their ancestors. So strangely enough, lemurs are tied to this old mythicness that we're talking about today. So we're going to kind of jump a ways here and talk about fairies. Now, fairies have gone through many different iterations throughout time. This term fairy goes back to mean the place where fairies lived, a place where fairies would meet. Fairy would also kind of be synonymous with sorcery, magic, witchcraft, enchantments. The word fae comes from the Latin fata, which is the fates. So the word is originated in the word fate, destiny, that of which is ordained. So to have fairies is tied to fate, strangely enough, right? As a trope of later times, as of the 17th century in children's storybooks, this is when we see them start to have wings and that they're more of these docile, helpful creatures. So, they became synonymous with these attributes of lightness, delicacy, innocence, right? And in older conceptions, more often, it was that the female fairies could tell fortunes, that they were prophetic, and that they could prophesize death. So they were also, in these older conceptions in the Middle Ages, tied to certain plants, that you could use certain plants to be rid of them, because it was actually something that you wanted to be rid of. You could use hawthorn trees, you could use foxglove, groundsel, yarrow, St. John's wort. All these things could be planted around to kind of keep the fairies away. And why they would want to is because they were understood as a misfortune. They could be dangerous and powerful creatures. They were sometimes helpful to humans, but most of the time they would be mischievous and they'd look for ways to do you wrong. So is fate a good thing? If we're tying it to this old understanding, is fate going to be kind to you, or is it something that you try to escape? It's kind of an interesting ethical dilemma there. You also see that in this kind of old story that you find something synonymous to fairies in India. In Sanskrit, it's the Gandharva, which are these kind of semi-divine celestial musicians. You also see it tied to the nymphs of Greek mythology. You also see them tied to the jinn, or the jinni, technically, of the Arabic lore. You have similar concepts in the Samoan people, in the Arctic indigenous people, and in the natives of America. So this concept of fairies is by no means unique. Some people have explained them as the like kind of mythologizing of gnats. So when it's really bright out, you know, you can see these little things moving in the air. And being that you couldn't see them microscopically, you might kind of give them a story as to what they do, what they are when they appear, as a kind of divinational sense. So again, these things can be explained rather mundanely, or we can kind of dive into the mythology and say that it's more literal, that maybe they are of a different density, of a different dimension, and of a certain type of mind or different sensory perception. You could interpret the fairies instead of just them being an invisible phenomena. But regardless of how we want to rationalize it, their concepts have changed. They are ubiquitous across the world, but the concepts have changed through time. So they are decidedly not of divinity. They are not a god or goddess or a minor divinity. They are near the divinity of human beings. So it's as if they exist in parallel dimension, if you want to look at it this way. They are not mortal. They tend to, at the very least, live very long lives, or are eternally there. So if you're looking at it from like a Kabbalah standard, or a multi-dimensional humanism standard, they are of an alternate dimensionality, which we'll try to explain that more as we go on. But since we're talking about fairies and how kind of messy that concept gets, we have to also talk about where this seems to be coming from in the Western tradition, which are the nymphs. So now we're talking Greek again, and the nymph is a class of semi-divine, so partially divine, female beings in classic mythology. They are interpreted as beautiful maidens that are eternally young. So they're demi-goddesses. Later on, it would earlier on, the word would just mean beautiful young woman, and later would become semi-divine being. So this group, nymphs, actually have several subgroups. Again, all this is much more complicated than we might assume. The subgroups are the Nereids, the Oreids, the Hamadryads, and the Dryads. So they all have these different subcategories. You can look into it if you're more interested. These subgroups also were kind of related to different places and different plants. So for instance, the Meliae were were ash tree nymphs. The Naiads were freshwater nymphs. And the Nereids were just the regular sea nymphs that would later be understood as mermaids. And the Oreids were mountain nymphs. So the concept of these nymphs, these beautiful women, these semi-divine beings, were that they were always tied to a specific place. They were bound to specific natural phenomena. So you would only see one if you were outside of the frequent area of human beings and you were alone. So they would seek out lone travelers. They would also gravitate towards where music was heard, and a traveler could see them bathing or dancing in a stream or pool or up on a mountain head. They had different ways that they thought like you could find one. They might appear in like a whirlwind. So these encounters throughout time were interpreted as potentially dangerous, and that you could be love stricken by seeing a nymph that would lead you to madness or basically an unfortunate circumstance. Now, what's interesting about this is in modern film classics, you have this concept of the femme fatale, which are the dangerous woman, the one that is the seductress, the one that kind of leads you on and puts you into a very compromising position. They would appear to be a great love, but they're actually secretly sinister. And this is where you find in the origination of the nymph. So there are different, variations on how sinister they were and how non-sinister they were. But if you want to take it more literally, this would be, way back before the Greek was an actual civilization, when it was more like tribes all along the different isles in the mainland. You'd have a lot of seafaringness, people going places that they'd never seen before. And there were places where just women existed. Lesbos is a more modern term, where it was just an island of women. But they might come across a woman that is much more beautiful than they'd ever seen in a strange place. And they were love stricken. They left and they were love stricken. And they kind of created this mythologization or this kind of poetization of these women that they would come across, being that they could never see it through. It was such a strange occurrence that they were seafaring and that they came across such a beautiful person that kind of disappeared or whatever. So you could see this starting as a very mundane concept, or as a catharsis for like a man who had been done wrong by a very kind of free-spirited wandering type of woman. So, through time and through mistranslation and misunderstanding, it becomes a bit of a meme. And that's another theme of how we can understand these ancient myths, right? So when it came to these different classifications of the different nymphs in the past, one that we had to talk about is the one that I mentioned, where was the water nymphs, which had a separate name, which was undines. These are female water spirits. The undine word is related to a wave. It literally means to wave. So the undine, which is Undine or Ondine, is a water nymph in particular. She would have men fall in love with her, but they would be doomed to die if they were unfaithful to her. So semi-divinity, okay? They were all attendants to the god Poseidon, being that they were of the water, and those who literally inhabit the element of water, so water spirits. What I also want to mention here is, again, this might make it seem like they're unreal, but we're talking about the Greek culture here. So we have the different astrological designations of what a person is. Somebody is a fire sign, they're an Aries, they're a Leo. Somebody's a water sign, they're a Cancer, they're a Pisces. So an undine in this way could be a kind of fictional account or an overly literal storification of a water type, a Cancer, a Pisces, a Scorpio, right? So another way that we can kind of dissect this, if you know a Cancer or a Scorpio, if you're like in the stereotype, if you're unfaithful to them, yeah, it's going to be a weird story. So this kind of spawned out several different concepts from this concept of undine, which the most popular one, of course, you can already guess, would be a mermaid. And throughout time, this depiction would change over and over and over again. So one of these concepts of the undine, or the early form mermaid, was that what they lacked compared to humans is a soul. And that if they could marry or hook up with a human, this would shorten their life overall on the earth, but it would earn them the immortality of a human soul. So this is, again, semi-divinity or slightly different divinity. And you see this concept in how J.R. Tolkien depicted the elves. I can't remember her name, but her marrying Aragorn would shorten her life, but give her a human soul, blah, blah, blah. So Paracelsus and these ancient concepts always would tie these creatures to different elemental aspects. So there were earth creatures, there were water creatures, there were air creatures, there were fire creatures. All these elementals would be participating in the very act of what makes that element do its thing. So why does the water wave? Why does the fire flicker? Why does the air burrow over itself and create whirls? Why does the earth groan? And the way of understanding this at a certain time in history, these invisible aspects of nature, was rationalized by the creatures. The creatures in the element make these specific functions happen in reality. So we're talking more of like metaphysics here when it comes to a different explanation of these fantastical mythic creatures. But while I'm at it, let's move on and kind of talk about how the mermaid came through. So, a fabled amphibian creature having the upper body of a woman and the lower body of a fish, with generally more human attributes than fish. So in these original concepts, they usually were not malignant. They did do wrong, but it was with or without intention. And literally, mermaid is Old English. The mer was the sea or water, and the maid was the woman. So literally, water woman. And you see how literal this is. So again, we could be talking about a water type woman, or we could be talking about a woman that's really into water. And to kind of make a meme out of it, you see, you'd make a picture of the woman having a fish lower body. This is also tied to the Greek concept of the siren, of which we'd get to, where the concept was that these mermaids would lure sailors to their death with this enchanting song. So, these sightings of mermaids might be a type of placebo or an observer effect, that people would hear these stories, not understand the meaning, and then think that they're hearing things, or that they did hear something and they say, oh, mermaid. You see what I'm going for here? However, this concept of the mermaid does go way, way back before the nymphs, even, to kind of retcon myself a little bit. It does go back to the Assyrians and the story of Atargatis, which is a mortal woman, or a Assyrian queen that fell in love with a shepherd and unintentionally killed him, and out of shame threw herself into the lake, and then subsequently somehow took the form of a fish. And there's all sorts of other analogies to go through in this myth. But you can look into that if this is a subject that you want to look more into. I'm trying to cover the whole smorgasbord here, but you can also find it traced even further back of taking a half partial fish form in the Babylonian god, Sumerian god Ea. So this is by no means a new concept at this point, that the undying would eventually lead to the mermaid. It's a kind of a meme or a trope that moved out throughout all of civilization, really. Okay, so to talk about the sirens, not just in their likeness to mermaids, you also have this account of Christopher Columbus saying that he saw mermaid sirens when he was in the Caribbean. But later interpretations of this would explain this, that he actually saw manatees, which you could say is an interesting blend between a fish and a mammal. Anyhow, so when it comes to the sirens, and mind you, how interesting today that we use this word as an alarm, like this is literally, the word originally is coming from this mythology, but now we use it as a siren, like a warning of a storm or something like that, right? So a siren in the original context was a sea nymph, a deceitful woman. The word comes from the word that means seta, or rope, or cord. So the word is coming from this understanding that they are an entangler or a binder, something that would ensnare you. It comes originally from the story of the Sirens, which are these mythical sisters that entice sailors to their death with their songs. And who knows how mundane the beginning of the story is, right? So It was only in the 80s that this actually the word siren became a mechanistic term. But back when, Plato would say that there are three kinds of sirens: the celestial sirens, which is a reference to Gabriel's horn, interestingly enough. Then you have the generative siren and the purification or the cathartic siren. So there's some more philosophical roots that we could dig into here. Zeus, trying to get back Persephone, would gift the sirens with wings. I believe that's the case. Them and the sirens, there's a mixed lead here, but they do bleed into mythology together, that they're involved with the gods, that they have these kind of different attributes. Some were believed to look like a combination of women and birds. So they might have the lower portion of a bird. There are many different depictions of them having more bird attributes, less bird attributes. They were represented as birds with large women's heads and with bird feathers and scaly feet. Later on, they were represented as female figures with legs and without wings. I mean, you're looking at all variations. Sometimes they would have musical instruments like harps and lyres. Sometimes they would take on the form of sparrows. They're always tied to the birds. And what do birds do? Birds sing. So again, this could have started with something as mundane as women that love to sing. And maybe their singing was so enchanting that men were wary of them because of how enticing they were. And so they created this meme of the siren. And that sailors are especially lonely people. And I mean, come on, guys. You can see how this could literally be a misunderstanding given throughout time. And the saying goes with these harpies. So harpy literally means a snatcher. The name Harpesian, which means literally to snatch. So these people were designated as repulsively greedy. So again, think of it as a meme, as a word to degrade somebody, to make them seem strange, or I don't know, to insult them. So you could also say that harpies in mythology is the literal personification of a storm. So like I mentioned in the Chimera talk, oftentimes the ancients would use a collection of human and animal attributes that they understood to symbolically create a creature that is a direct allegory of something that is invisible or something that is incorporeal, like the season of winter, or the eruption of a volcano, or the depiction of a storm. So in this way, what does the storm do? I mean, in their mythology, it's a general disgusting thing because people didn't, a sailing culture, their greatest fear was a storm. So they had the heads like maidens, which is a reference to, the potential beauty of a storm, but they were always hungry and they had these claws that would dig deep into you. So what can a storm do? It can utterly destroy the body or the vessel of the ship. So again, this is a great reference of how it can be either a meme that was created about specific types of people, or it could also be a reference to an allegory for something incorporeal like storm winds. So if a person suddenly disappeared, the Greeks would say that they were carried off by the Harpies. So this is something to explain the inexplainable, or to reference that this person is dead because the storm killed them. And that's why old sailors would always say, it was the Harpies, It's always been tied to the sailors. Now, similarly, kind of to cross over a little bit, we have the banshee, and all of these are female related, mind you. That's why I'm roping them together. In Irish folklore, it was a female fairy, which I've talked about already, and that is always singing in a mournful or unearthly voice that would foretell death. So this comes from this concept of a Bean Sid, which is a female of the elves. literally fairy. And the origination and how you can explain a banshee is later mythologized and is apparently a creature, right? But originally there was a job in Ireland that were called keeners, and keeners were hired to grieve either at a funeral or outside of the house of somebody who's expected to die. This is kind of midsummer vibes, you know? They're taking on that emotion to expel it so that other people don't have to suffer as much. That was the idea of the keeners. And their wailing would inspire other people to grieve for the dead as well. So you know, to pay homage to them, to respect the dead. So they were active around the 8th century, and they eventually would kind of fall out of popularity. And when they did fall out of popularity, then you start to see this mythologization of the banshees, the form of these sweet singing virgins of the family who died young. And they have a mission to warn others of the mortality of their family. So you see, you could also see how the banshee could be explained through the owl. So the owl in totem, in an ancient myth, was always the harbinger of death. If you saw an owl, it meant that death was coming, either to you or to somebody around you, or something to that effect. And the owl's screech is very notable, mind you. And not to mention, if you're out in the woods and it's got this mysterious kind of vibe, and you hear like an elk's mating call, and you don't even know what an elk is, you would have different cultural superstitions to explain that, you see. So the general mythology, to kind of get back on track a little bit, is that if somebody was to hear this kind of cry, how they'd understand it is that somebody in your family is going to die soon. That would be the kind of superstition that comes from this. And mind you, see, this is what's happening. You have the keeners, you have these concepts of owls, and then through time, it kind of gets a little bit more memed, a little bit more memed, a little bit more misunderstood as it moves through time. And then all of a sudden, we're looking at it in contemporary times and we're thinking, what's up with this, right? So they can appear as withered old hags, or they could appear as beautiful women. They usually are depicted wearing this kind of shadowy gray, and their eyes are always weeping. So it's literally this personification of grief. When they are depicted hideously, they have these really droopy breasts, and they have only one nostril, and their feet are webbed. So they can be ghoulish, but they are never harmful of individuals. They're warnings. So they're looked at as favorable or non-violent. They're literally the personification of hypersensitivity to sadness. This again could be a meme of specific types of women. Women that feel pain for other people, people that they don't even know, hyper empathic. And that, you know, this just got carried out, and now we have a concept of women that are like you that's over exaggerated, much like we saw with the Sirens and the Nymphs. Okay. So to kind of bring it back a little bit, this is a big one. Oh man, elves. Elves are supernatural beings. It's a race of supernatural beings in Germanic folklore. It's related to the words goblin, incubus, fairy, and sprite. You have this unequivocal definition that they are a mischievous person in the early conceptions. So J.R. Tolkien really did change elves to the positive. Back in the day, it was definitely not that way. The Germanic elf was dwarfish and mischievous, even malicious. They believed that they caused nightmares and that they caused hiccups. You actually have several names that are derived from the name elf. One of them is Alfred, which means the elf council, or the Alvin, which means the friend of elves, or Eldridge, which is the elf ruler. This is rather convoluted, I know, but it was essentially, as it moved through time, a spirit of any kind, and that it was generally depicted as a tiny human. So it's kind of got these ties to the dwarves, interestingly enough. And they were believed in several areas at several times of past to be tied to diseases in humans and in cattle. They were believed that they would sit upon your chest and cause bad dreams. The German word for nightmare is literally translated as elf pressure. And they were said to steal children and put changelings in their stead. Again, we're seeing the theme of the boogeyman again, potentially. Medieval elves were a mix between the Greek nymphs and what we understand as elves today. So this would give them more of the beauty. So before they were completely ugly, and now they're turning more beautiful as different mythologies blend together. In time, elves also became indistinct with fairies. That's why I mentioned them right away. Alternate dimensionality beings that participate in a parallel dimension to ours. You see maybe the most true account to this survive in Icelandic folklore, which is the Huldu folk. I think I'm saying that right. It's translated as the hidden people. They are supernatural beings that live in nature. They look and behave exactly like humans, but they live in a parallel world. They are only seen when they want to be seen. So they have the ability to show themselves in our sensory perception. They served as warnings in fables to prevent children from wandering too far out into the woods. So you see, this is so literal at this point. The idea is to instill fear into nature. So you don't want your kids running off and getting eaten up by a wolf, freezing to death, falling off a cliff, right? So you lean into this concept of the hidden people, or the elves, or the fairy. And these ideas change through time because you have to keep changing the stories to make it continually do this before the kids don't believe it anymore. So there's that. The hidden folk are this direct tie from, the Nordic ancestors to the Icelandic, contemporary folklore. And most people in Iceland don't differentiate between elves and the hidden people. They believe that they're the same exact thing. So interesting here. Some people take it more seriously, some people take it less seriously. Now, one of the definitions mentioned when I was defining elves was incubus. And this is one that comes up. It's also a modern band, or during the 90s it was, early 2000s. Incubus and succubus are tied together completely. These are the demons that appear during sleep paralysis. The ancients were very afraid of them. The monks would sleep with crosses over their crotches because they feared the succubus making them have wet dreams. And they literally believed that they would create demons or half demons through their seed if these demons could steal it during their sleep. The incubus in particular is the male, and it comes from the word incuber, which means to lie upon. So it's a frequent experience in sleep paralysis that something is pushing you down, that there's somebody there, you can't move, and that they're pushing you down, which makes it's hard to breathe. They're terrifying to you. And this is why incubus is likened to the elves, because again, elves were thought to push down on your chest, elf pressure for nightmares, remember? And then more sexually connotated was that the incubus were the specific demons that would appear as a male to inhabit the dreams of women, and that succubuses were the demons that would take the form of women to prey upon men during their dreams. So in times of more spirituality and culture, these things were understood as spirits. Nowadays, I don't even know how they try to explain sleep paralysis entities, but this is something that people still experience today. So essentially the word succubus and incubus was the old form word for these things. And they came up with a lot of stories and seriousness around these creatures. Um, there was so much commentary on the like, but it, again, I'm going to repeat, this concept goes all the way back to Sumeria and Mesopotamia. And it's the story of Lelitu, a female demon that appears to men in erotic dreams. So this is an old, old trope. And yes, when I'm saying Lelitu, you are, if you're familiar with the Lilith myth, this is the same. This is where the Lilith myth is originating from. If you're those unfamiliar, the old story is that Lilith was Adam's first wife before Eve, and she refused to lay under Adam, and she refused to return to the Garden of Eden. And then there's a kind of ham-fisted story that aligns her with the devil, and essentially she's one of these many goddesses, dark demons that take the form of a beautiful young girl and prey upon men in their dreams, cause miscarriages. And there's a lot of hideous depictions of these creatures. I don't want to get into the details, but if you're going to look into it, I guess be warned. And strangely enough, there are often times that they are depicted having bird-like claws, harpies, and having serpentine tails. Sound familiar? Just like Tied to the Vampires, right? Half woman, half serpent. So since I mentioned incubuses, succubuses, elves, another definition that goes along with elves are the goblins. We see this depiction a lot in video games, stories, general mythologies. You even see it in, Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. Its definition is a devil, an incubus, a mischievous, an ugly fairy. The word goblin is tied back to the Greek word kabalos, which meant rogue or knave or wicked spirit invoked by the rogues. A goblin is a more monstrous creature. So you know how elves in time became more innocent, became more benevolent or more fair, basically goblins were a reaction to keep that negativeness around. So it kind of split them off, right? You see what I'm saying here? And goblins are known to attach themselves to households. Well, they'll bang pots and pans, they'll snatch clothing off of people, they'll mess with people who are sleeping, they'll knock at the walls. This could be a kind of depiction of ghosts, or of bad luck. When you have bad luck, everything seems to go wrong. If people think that they have ghosts in the house, they'll swear that they'll hear like knocking and things like that. Deep in the night, something finally moves. It kind of makes these weird creaking noises. Goblins, you see, there's your understanding. Goblins. And so they could literally be understood as invisible entities that bring bad luck. So it was a spirit of bad luck, a goblin. You see, when you have that air about you, when you know that you're having a bad day and everything goes wrong, it was just a way of understanding that by saying goblin. It's not that you're taking it super literally, but it's just a concept to explain that natural phenomena. I hope you see where I'm kind of trying to dissect this from. So the mythologizing or the storification is that the goblin makes its home in the mountains and it's waiting for an opportunity to generally take a treasure. So if you are carrying something important and you lose it, several people nowadays will like lose their wallet or lose their phone. If this was still our concept, we would say a goblin took it. And it's not to make it sound literal necessarily, but it's a way of explaining what happened. A goblin took it. You see what I'm saying here? And similarly to a goblin, we have this old concept of the dwarf, which, has been changed its definition throughout time, I understand. But in this old definition was a supernatural being of subhuman size. They were also in the old tradition tied to the black elves. Sometimes there are white elves, sometimes there are black elves, meaning innocent, good, and the ones that were more nefarious or a different type of elf. So these black elves in Old Norse were what would be eventually tied to the dwarves. They demonstrated a healing or an ability to heal. They also would demonstrate an ability to create or smith, metallurgy. There is originally no mention of them being short. The mention is that they are of lesser supernatural beings. They are lesser divinity. So they are of a lower vibration than we are. And then later on, as the Christians would take on this myth, they would literally depict them as short. So again, here we're seeing a misunderstanding of the original language or mythos or understanding that the culture had. And strangely enough, too, dwarves had this trope of the cloak of invisibility. They could make themselves invisible whenever they wanted to. So this cloak of invisibility, that of which you see in many fantastical stories such as Harry Potter, originally is an homage to dwarves, interestingly enough. So in appearance, they were sometimes beautiful, but most of the time they looked like wretched old men, hunchbacks and all that. Sometimes they were depicted as shorter than like 1.5 feet. Other times they were likened to the same stature as like a 2-year-old child. Many legends would say that they're kind and generous if you were befriended them, and they were vengeful and short-tempered if you made them upset. So you wanted them on your side. In the Swiss culture, they were literally earthmen. They did agricultural work. They helped find stray animals, and they put out firewood that would otherwise cause forest fires. And they gave fruit to poor children. So are these literal men, in these old myths that dwarves are actually a certain type of men? Are they a lesser divinity people that the ancients somehow knew about that participate in a different level of vibration? Or are they, again, an invisible trope that explain things like if you just so happen to have a very beneficial year of growing things, you could say the dwarves helped me. You know what I'm saying? Or if you just so happen to come across a stray animal that was needed to be found, you could say the dwarves helped you. Later on, or originally as well, they were depicted as mind-dwelling. They had a lot to do with treasures. But I'm not going to get into that as much because the one that gets more of that reference are the gnomes, which again are very closely related. They literally mean dwarf-like earth-dwelling spirit, the nomos or the nomus. And you could tie this to a few different names. You could tie this to the old word for pygmy, or you could tie this to the word gnosis, meaning knowing, or those who know, or you could tie this to the word genemos, which means earth dweller. So gnomes were something that you wanted to have on your side. They were viewed as earth spirits. Again, we have water, we have air, we have fire spirits. These are earth spirits. They resembled a dry, gnarled old man, much like dwarves. There are all sorts of stories that go along with this, but what I want to talk about is that gnomes help with finding riches. They were associated with good money management skills. They were associated with great wisdoms. So you're an old prospector and you want to strike it rich. How are you going to find where the gold is? How are you going to find where those precious stones are, the silver, so on? You just so happen to get an intuition that points you to the right place. You would say the gnomes helped you. Or you come up with a good business idea and and it turns out that it's very beneficial. This idea came out of nowhere. You could say that the gnomes told you. Whether you're literally believing them in them as spirit or alternate dimensionality being, or you're just using it as a trope of a cultural understanding. So the general belief is over time, for some reason, they became more mischievous. That's why you see gnomes depicted as dropping their pants, that they liked silly pranks for some reason. This is the changing of meme throughout time. So the idea is that gnomes somehow have a special connection to the earth. They were viewed as tutelary spirits, which means guardian spirits of the earth, which is why they're put in gardens, because they would guard the gardens. The gnomes were guardian spirits, making the garden flourish, protecting it from insects, these sorts of things, as a motif. Now, of course, assumably, then I have to go along and talk about the leprechaun. Right? Like, come on, we're just jumping across with the same idea, just different cultures here, right? So the lukerpan, which literally means a very small body. Lu meaning little, and corpan meaning body, coming from the Latin corpus, like corporation, meaning body. This is one explanation. You could also tie it to a misunderstanding that the Irish had of the Latin ceremony of Lupercalia. Okay, so the Luperci were a bunch of aristocrats that would run naked through ancient Rome. Historian compared Lupercalia with this myth of Greek werewolves. I know this is really messy, that these naked men were believed to change from men into wolves at night by swimming through the lake of Arcadia. They could probably say that they turned into wolves because they got wild, you see? It's not literal, it's just an allegory that's being misunderstood as it's crossing cultures. And 2 centuries later, Irish scholars misunderstand this, and they use this word, this thought of the Luperci as a ancient non-human race, you know, these wolf people. And then later on, they get rid of the wolf part of this, and they keep this idea of a non-human race. Thus, the little Luperci. They, I don't know. I know that's a pretty lengthy explanation, but effectively now it's used for kind of modern Irish folklore, you know, or, you know, as a kind of touristy thing, a thing for selling kind of gimmicky goods. They were generally depicted as fairy-like creatures that were friendless, and they liked their own privacy. They also have sometimes been depicted as mischievous, house-haunting drunkards, which again is tied to the culture. So you could think of the leprechaun as a cultural expression of the Irish. This idea of him possessing a little bit of gold, if captured with of bodily violence, he would give it up. But if you look away from him, then they go away. So then you have to keep your eye on the leprechaun. I don't know how to explain that other than that it's just adding myth. The thing about them being obsessed with shoes, though, you can explain, because the leprechauns were always depicted to be dancing, that they loved dancing. So they would always ruin their shoes. So thus they're depicted always working on their shoes or wearing nice shoes, because they never know when they're going to get hit with a fit of dancing. And again, this is really tied to the Irish culture. They really like that dancing. And a lot of their dancing, I'm not remembering the name right now, but it involves a lot of leg work. So then the leprechaun becomes this kind of conduit of an expression of the culture. So that's another understanding here, is that it's a cultural phenomena that the mythologizing isn't literalizing, but it's expressing. As a last one that I want to talk about, or technically last 2, and then I'm going to be through and we can go through an explanation, are things that I can fully explain without any ambiguity whatsoever. One is the centaur. They don't know where this word comes from, but the Greeks are looking over at these people that live over by Thessaly. And they said these men are half horse, half men in their records, okay? Also, the term Sagittarius, you know, the astrological sign that is a centaur, is also referred to as the wanderer, okay? Now, it's not that they literally believed in the half horse, half men. It's that they were talking about a people that they would see that were never off their horses. They were nomadic. They were always traveling, and they were wanderers. So not only did they have this trope created so that they could represent what a wanderer was in culture via the centaur or the centaur, but also it was a way of poking fun at their neighbors. You see the kind of snickering that could go on here. And then in time, we lost that context, and we think that they literally thought that this was a thing. No. The personification or the iconography or the symbol of the centaur is a literal representation of the wandering aspect of people. So those people of the wild, the nomadic, the lawless, or the inhospitable people that are very passionate, centaurs. It's a creation of folklore that was a misunderstanding after the fact. Although if you wanted to mythologize it more, then you could say that they were earth spirits or air spirits or the spirits of the forest or the savages of the forest. And the last one I want to touch on to completely explain is the unicorn. I had to save it for last, right? Unicorn, one corn. Uni meaning one. Cornus meaning horn, one horn, literally that of which has one horn. Or a later word for it, or an earlier word for it would have been monoceros, meaning, again, one horn. This quite plainly can be understood to be a continual mistranslation of the first appearance of a rhinoceros, an Indian rhinoceros. So as the Greeks were traveling about, as Alexander was conquering it all, they saw these strange creatures and they report back, I saw something that kind of seemed like a horse, has hooves, walks on four legs, trots about with a horn, and originally say it's big and it has this sort of skin. And then through time, through the telephone game, then they become somehow smaller and look more and more like a horse, and they maintains that rhinoceros horn, right? And in the original descriptions of when they were seeing the rhinoceros, they said that the horn curved up, like the rhinoceros horn does. But then you see in these later depictions of the unicorn that it's just straight up. And similarly, the obsession with the rhinoceros horn or the unicorn horn was likewise to the narwhal, which we all know now is an actual literal thing. But the search for the unicorn is something that's right under our noses, which is the rhinoceros. And this old trope of using the horn as a medicinal property is as old as the Middle Ages and older, that it would help indigestion, that it would help blood conditions. This is definitely still having reverberations in culture today with people poaching rhinoceroses in Asia, Africa. So that's it. I'm going to stop there. I didn't know how many I was going to get through before I could end this. There's several more that you can dig into that you can see in this same method. Genies, gorgons, or ogres, jinns, gargoyles. They all have this different cultural understanding that makes them much more mundane and not literal. Not literal. So here's our different ways, and here's your kind of method if you want to dig into this more and kind of dispel all of these fantastical creatures and kind of nerd out at Halloween parties and explaining to people what they're actually wearing, right? So here's our different ways of understanding the past and these mythical animals. You could say that some are divine creatures of different divinity that are actually observable to the ancients, being that they were more sensitive to these things and they weren't inundated with stimulus like we are nowadays. That is your spiritual approach to these things. You have creatures that are potentially upper density or semi-divine or slightly above us, for instance, the nymphs. Or you have these creatures that are slightly lower vibration that exist in a lower end of beingness that are near enough to us for us to actually observe if we're in the right places of the right mentality or are in the right hypnagogic transient states. Or you could be taking this more literally, that those that would be partaking in sacred medicines, ayahuasca, DMT, different mushrooms of different cultural histories, seeing creatures in the wild or in strange places, personifying them, talking about them, and then them being misunderstood or mistranslated throughout time to create these utterly fictitious, so far from the truth, cultural taboos that nobody even understands what it's really about anymore. Now that's the spiritual understanding of things. Now you could also say that these are just simply forgotten meaninged memes, that there was memes in cultures that everybody understood, much like we have today. We have all these memes. And if you could only imagine what different nations of the future would do in seeing our memes, like for instance, if they saw the old meme of Harambe and what's been done with Harambe, they might think that we worshipped Harambe, or like Pepe, you know, like this would be funny to the people that really understand what it's about. And you just don't have the cultural context. And so you're just fundamentally, hilariously misunderstanding where it's actually coming from. So cultural misunderstandings. And you see that the concepts of these old myths, like the elves and so on, the dwarves, change in appearance, change in meaning as they cross different cultures. So you could look at it as a game of cultural telephone, passing tropes around. You could also just simply give it up to all these fearful entities being boogeymen for keeping children obedient, which we still do today with Santa Claus, right? If you're good, he'll bring you good presents, and if you're bad, then he'll bring you coal. We still do this today in trying to coddle the youth's mind with mythological understandings. So in this way, I wanted to dispel many of the concepts, or say that add this spiritual element, what have you, but this is your way of understanding the ancient mythical creatures. And with that, I'll close.